I am so happy to welcome you to today's webinar, Exploring Social Emotional Learning and Foundational Skills. This is part of the Education in Crisis and Conflict Learning series, which is meant to help members access, apply, and share evidence, resources, and tools related to topics that are drawn from USAID's Education in Crisis and Conflict Learning agenda. My name is Kate Lapham, and I am the lead for the Education in Crisis and Conflict Network. So while we are presenting today in English, live interpretation is available in French and Spanish. To access the French or Spanish channel, please select the corresponding channel from the interpretation icon that you will find either at the bottom or top of your screen. And if you have any questions about Zoom functionality, please send a private message to USAID ECCN by searching the participant list. Also a reminder, we are recording this session. It will be available on the Leading Through Learning Global Platform YouTube channel after the event. So the topic of social emotional learning is a priority for USAID's work in education. The webinar today provides an opportunity to share evidence aligned to one of the key questions of USAID's Education in Crisis and Conflict Learning agenda. Specifically, what is the impact of well-being interventions on student learning outcomes in crisis and conflict affected settings? So the objective of the webinar and workshop on Thursday are to understand first how the EdIntersect team conducted baseline assessment measuring SEL, reading and numeracy skills, as part of USAID's Learn Together activity in Tajikistan. And that is the primary objective of today's webinar. On Thursday, we will also have the opportunity to come together again in a more interactive workshop to meet the last three objectives on this slide. So to investigate the emerging
objectifs que vous voyez ici dans cette deuxième partie. Donc ça, c'est
Recomendaciones para la contextualidad, la sostenibilidad.
To discuss opportunities and challenges, contextualizing and measuring social emotional learning in crisis and conflict affected settings, and to exchange some best practices, experiences, and recommendations for contextualization, sustainability, and host community uptake. Before we dive in, I have a few reminders for you. First of all, closed captioning is available in English. To access this, click on the CC icon at the bottom or top of your screen, depending on your Zoom version. Second, we will be inviting you to post questions or comments in Slido as you are listening, and you'll be able to upvote the questions and comments that are provided by others as we go. So watch for that link in the chat. Third, please make sure that you are muted and your camera is off to preserve the bandwidth of those who are calling in and participating. And finally, just a reminder that we are recording this for those who have joined late, and it will be shared publicly after the event. So the Education in Crisis and Conflict Network is part of USAID's Leading Through Learning Global Platform, which includes two other global learning networks, the Higher Education Learning Network, or HELEN, and the Global Reading Network, GRN, as well as LTLGP regional representatives in Africa and in Latin America and the Caribbean. We hope that in addition to staying tuned to ECCN, you will be interested in collaboration across this platform. If you are not already a member, you can register now to receive invites to future events for all of the networks and chapters, as well as other opportunities to convene with fellow members and to engage. So now I'd like to introduce today's speakers. First, Dr. Mary Faith Mountcourt is founder and president of EdIntersect, a certified woman-owned small business that provides technical leadership across thematic and functional areas of monitoring, evaluation, research and learning processes, gender and inclusion, and teaching and learning from early childhood to primary education through higher education. Dr. Mountcourt has worked on literacy programs, education strategy, teacher training, and curriculum developments in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean, and the Pacific. Dr. Michel Rousseau is an associate professor at Université du Québec à Trois-Rivières, where he teaches psychometrics and research methods at the undergraduate and graduate levels. For EdIntersect, Dr. Rousseau provides assessment, statistics, and monitoring and evaluation expertise on the USAID Tajikistan Learning Together activity. He is experiencing some technical difficulties this morning, so we very much hope that he will be able to join us. And finally, last but certainly not least, Dr. Louise Bahry is an innovative educational research, measurements, and evaluation professional who provides assessment, statistics, and monitoring and evaluation expertise on the USAID Tajikistan Learn Together activity and the USAID Malawi Next Gen program. So, before we get started, please note that we will be collecting audience questions throughout the session. You can use the QR code on the screen or the information in the chat to submit your questions. So I will now pass it on to Louise to kick off today's presentation.
Thank you, Kate. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. It's been a lot of fun seeing all of the folks introducing themselves in the chat. So welcome, whatever time of day it is for you. We're appreciative of you being here. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about how this all falls together. First, USAID has supported basic education in Tajikistan for more than 10 years, including the recently ended USAID Read With Me project and the current USAID Learn Together activity that we're here to talk about. You can see here in the slide that LTA is a 5-year project funded by USAID. It aims to improve primary students' learning in Tajikistan and focuses on reading comprehension, critical thinking skills, and mathematics. It's implemented by Chemonics International as the prime, and we at EdIntersect are one of their partners. In addition to creating reading and math supplementary materials, there is also an objective to improve government capacity to develop and implement a cohesive primary education policy and program. You'll notice that we've bolded critical thinking skills here because this is really the place through which the focus on social emotional learning comes in. While the study we will talk about was a baseline for LTA and some programmatic content was still under development, we summarize here some of what LTA is planning to implement related to social emotional learning through both explicit and integrated approaches, including assessment standards and teacher and head teacher training on learning environment and SEL, materials such as reading and math cards with images, storybooks, summer camp content, parental guides, public service announcements, and TV episodes. The Learn Together activity will conduct a social emotional learning assessment as a part of its EGRA-EGMA baseline, midline, and endline, with the midline coming up very soon in the spring of 2024. The government of Tajikistan will gain valuable data from this exercise, particularly as it applies to student learning outcomes. The majority of research looking into the relationships between social emotional learning and foundational skills comes from high-income countries. We know that the domains of child development, social, emotional, cognitive, linguistic, and academic, are interconnected in the brain and all have a role to play in learning. Also, programs that promote social emotional learning have shown significant gains in academic performance for students. With the majority of that knowledge about those, while the majority of that knowledge about those relationships is coming from high-income countries, we need to consider that learners from low and middle-income countries could certainly face different challenges, especially if they live in conflict-affected areas. Little is known about these relationships between SEL and academic performance in those contexts. So this data collection in Tajikistan that includes an SEL measure, an early grade reading assessment, and an early grade math assessment gives us the opportunity to learn more about the links in those areas. And I'm going to hand off to Mary Faith to talk a little bit about the contextualization process.
Thank you, Louise, and hello to everyone. So now we will delve into some important contextual factors relevant to Tajikistan. So here we want to give a few socioeconomic indicators to ground us in a middle-income country. Tajikistan ranks number 48 out of the 51 countries in Asia that were indexed for per capita gross domestic product at just under 900 US dollars. The average monthly salary is 194 US dollars. So think about what that means for a teacher's salary in an urban or rural area of the country. The education system bears the effects of the Civil War and also recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic with disparities between rural and urban areas. It includes 4 years of primary education from age 7, followed by 7 years of secondary school with around a 90% gross enrollment rate. The primary languages of the education system are Tajik and Russian. Uzbek and Pamiri languages are prevalent in some homes and communities of the country, such as in the Gorno-Badakhshan Autonomous Province, or Gabao for Pamiri language. Girls' enrollment lags a bit behind boys' enrollment, especially at the secondary level. Pre-primary education has about a 10% gross enrollment rate. High rates of labor migration mean that many children live in skipped generation families, and both labor migration and the domestic economy have been affected by the war in Ukraine. Okay, so tensions in the Gabao region of Tajikistan affect the Pamiri minority, who have a different language, religious, and cultural background than other Tajik citizens. The tensions intensified in May of 2022 when we were collecting data there. This followed the killing of a young activist and protests that came afterwards. The government responded with arrests and use of force. The UN called on all parties to exercise restraint so the situation would not spiral out of control. As a result, the LTA baseline data collection in that region had to be cut short. So we asked the question, would we see differences in this group of students in SEL skills and relationships with reading and math, given the tensions and conflict in the region? In thinking about adapting measurement tools to cultural context, we have been helped by looking at this conceptual framework for intercultural communication and comparison. You see in this slide a graphic contrasting low context and high context cultures. While cultures and people within them will vary as well, these characteristics can help in understanding behaviors, reactions, and styles encountered in various contexts. For instance, a low context culture, as we may characterize the US, tends to favor explicit information and direct communication, while a high context culture, as we may categorize Tajikistan, may favor more implicit and nuanced communication. Adapting SEL tools goes well beyond a simple process. It delves into language, but also dynamics of the culture. All this to say that communications within cultures, including concepts in social emotional learning, are not direct translations from one context to another. They need to be discussed and understood within that context, and building shared understanding of constructs and measurement approaches needs to take into account the intercultural specificities. So before our tool development exercise in October of 2021, we spent time with the curriculum in Tajikistan, and then also with existing tools measuring social emotional skills, especially the ISELA developed by Save the Children. It has been tested, adapted, and used in many countries. You'll see 3 areas in the Tajikistan curriculum. One is self-awareness and self-management. Another is responsive decision-making. And the third is called social interaction. On the right is what was on the measurement tool that we developed with the ministry and used in Tajikistan that corresponded to those 3 areas in the curriculum. And those are relationships and communication, stress management, empathy, perseverance, conflict resolution, interactions with school children, and self-concept. We conducted a workshop, as I mentioned, in October of 2021. It was 11 days in Dushanbe, and it included pre-testing the instruments and revision and refinement after. We had participation from the Ministry of Education and Science, the National Testing Center, the Institute for Education. We also had teachers and staff of LTA and EdIntersect. So we had 27 participants, 14 women and 13 men overall, and we developed and pre-tested. We had certain EGRA tasks that we were developing and pre-testing. There had been an existing set of tasks and we needed to redevelop some. We then created a new EGMA instrument for the program, which is a math instrument, and then an SEL assessment instrument for the program, both in all of these in Tajik and Russian and for grades 2 and 4. These tools were used for investigation of levels of reading, math, and social emotional learning competencies achieved in grades 2 and 4 in the schools that would be participating in the Learn Together activity. The pre-testing of the tools raised some interesting issues. There were questions on the register of language appropriate for 2nd and 4th graders and finding the most appropriate terms and way of speaking to young children about these concepts in Tajik and in Russian. Feeling, perception, and emotion were all used in the empathy domain, and the proper word choice needed to be made. For example, from the stress management domain, we had responses from students, read a book to this question about a stress management strategy. This was then added to the acceptable responses for the scoring on the assessment. Another example is in the self-concept domain. That includes drawing. Participants in the pre-test suggested more training would be needed for assessors so that they understand how it unfolds and that it's okay to wait and also to carry out the task patiently with the children. Some children wanted to draw pictures even after the time expired, and one wanted to continue and drew to the end. One question was also about if on the self-concept domain, the child asked to write rather than draw, will this be allowed? And on that issue, the discussion was around how important it is to retain the drawing, because the other aspect on self-concept is that we're asking them to draw specifically, and feeling confident enough to do that is another element inherent in self-concept. So in the end, 2 tools, one in Tajik and one in Russian, were finalized for use with grade 2 and grade 4 students in classrooms where students are learning math and reading in those 2 languages. There was a quote translated to me when we were saying goodbye to one of our principal ministry colleagues that worked with us on the instrument development. And he said, "You came with your tools and we made them ours." And this was really a succinct summary of the process we had gone through together, and now we were ready to move forward from there. So I think, as Michel is still not able to get on this call, he's traveling, I'm going to proceed. So now we're going to discuss findings of the baseline study. First, we'll talk about some general SEL findings and any differences we saw in the analysis by grade or language. And second, we'll talk about relationships between the SEL tasks and the AGMA and AGRA results, so the math and reading results. And finally, about some of the important moderators we found in this study. The average size of the household that we found in our study was about 5 for students in Russian classrooms and 6 for students in Tajik classrooms, on average people per household. That was pretty consistent across students learning in those types of classrooms. So 5 to 6 in a household. Most of the students in the Tajik and Russian samples reported that they have someone to go to at home for support when they were feeling sad, having a problem with a friend, or working on something difficult. This reported support in the home did not vary by grade level, so from grade 2 to 4. When asked about peer support, students from Tajik classrooms from grade 2 identified on average 5.21 friends, while students in grade 4 have identified almost 4.72 friends. Most of the students report having a friend to talk about when they're feeling sad, but a smaller percentage have a friend to go to when having a problem with another child. When asked about support from outside the home from other adults, about half of the students from Tajik classrooms reported that they have an adult outside their home that they can talk to when feeling sad, and more than 60% have an adult to go to when having a problem with another child. Finally, more than 70% of students report knowing when an adult in school or in the knowing they can talk with when an adult in school or in the community is feeling sad. So more than half of the students identified at least 2 stress management strategies. There were no differences by grade or language group on that. Students in grade 4 performed better on the empathy task, meaning that a higher percentage of students in grade 4 were able to provide adequate answers to the different questions. For the perseverance task, we observed that more Tajik students in grade 4 than grade 2 attempted up to the 4th and final drawing. More Russian students also attempted up to the 4th drawing than Tajik students. A similar pattern was observed for conflict resolution, where with Tajik students, we saw that more students in grade 4 identified up to 4 strategies than in grade 2, and more Russian students overall identified more strategies than Tajik students. Finally, for the self-concept subtask, we also observed that Tajik students performed better in grade 4 than in grade 2, while there is no difference between grades for the students in Russian classrooms. Here we can see the results of the regression analyses performed to determine relationships between the SEL tasks and oral reading fluency and reading comprehension subtasks from the AGRA, the reading assessment. In the tables, we have reported the standardized coefficient, which represents the change in the ORF, the oral reading fluency, or the reading comprehension scores, with each increase in 1 point on the SEL task. In addition, we have used a heat map to better show the statistical significance of the relationships. The colors move from red, no relationship, to green, strong relationship, with the gradations of colors showing the strength of the relationship. There is no clear pattern regarding the relationship between SEL and the performance of students on oral reading fluency and reading comprehension tasks. Overall, results on the relationships and communication tasks show no significant
Relations et communication ne montrent aucune relation
significativa con el desempeño de las estudiantes en las dos.
Many significant relationships with the oral reading fluency across grades and languages of instruction, while we found significant relationships for reading comprehension. For the 3 other SEL subtasks, we found significant relationships in 3 out of the 4 subgroups for oral reading fluency or reading comprehension, but it's not always the same subgroup that shows a non-significant relationship. Overall, the strength of the associations found are not very high. They're around 0.20, with the highest value being at 0.4. Okay, so to analyze the relationship between SEL tasks and EGMA, the math assessment, we computed a total score based on the score of the students on the different EGMA tasks. Results show fewer associations between the different SEL tasks and the overall performance of the students on the EGMA. There are not many significant relationships, and most of them show weaker associations than what we observed for reading. Perseverance and conflict resolution are the two tasks showing a significant relationship in 3 out of the 4 subgroups. Next, we move to the moderator analysis. A moderator is a variable usually representing subgroups, which we use to evaluate if the strength of an observed association between two variables varies from one level of the moderators to the other. In other words, the associations between SEL and reading or mathematics are measured overall by grade and language. And this moderation analysis is helpful to know if those associations are the same for boys and girls, or if students reside in an urban or rural area. Testing for moderation requires that we run the same analysis as the one run to check for associations between SEL and EGRA or EGMA presented above, and check if the observed association is different for one group compared to another. For example, to check if the strength of an association is the same for girls as for boys. 2 moderators were tested, gender and urbanicity. Those 2 moderators are usually used in this kind of analysis, and data are easily available. Socioeconomic status is also often interesting to look for moderation, but the data we had on this variable did not provide an adequate measure of SES, or socioeconomic status. Overall, we didn't find much of a moderation effect in the different analyses we conducted. Urbanicity shows some moderation effects, and results suggest that the association is stronger in rural areas than in urban areas. That is to say, higher scores on SEL in rural areas showed a stronger relationship with EGMA and EGRA than in urban areas. A hypothesis to explain this is that there is more variability in students living in rural areas than in urban areas. As for gender, when there is moderation, most of the time the observed association is stronger for girls than for boys. But this is even less systematic than what we observed when we looked at urbanicity. So now I will pass back to Louise.
Thanks, Mary Faith. Okay, so in conclusion, older students in grade 4 tended to show greater levels of overall SEL competencies than students in grade 2. We also observed that students in Russian classrooms tended to show greater levels of SEL competency than students in the Tajik language of instruction classrooms. But this could in part be explained by the fact that students in Russian classrooms came mostly from urban areas, while students in the Tajik classrooms came from both urban and rural areas. No systematic association was found between the different SEL competencies and reading and mathematics. For reading, empathy, stress management, and conflict resolution showed significant associations in 3 of the 4 subgroups. We also observed that most associations were stronger in grade 2 than in grade 4. For mathematics, associations with SEL competencies are weaker than for reading, and we did not observe any systematic patterns in those associations. There are a few limitations we wanted to discuss with the study. First, with these tools, there is limited possibility to show variation because of the limited number of possible points that a student can get. For example, scores for stress management can only go from 0 to 3, as students are asked if they can provide a stress management strategy, then another, and another. The questioning and probing ends there. The association is a measure based on variability. So limiting the range of the scores limits the possibility of detecting an association. Second, given the correlational design of the study, it is not possible to conclude any causal effect. So the observed correlations used are only associations, and results should not be used to conclude that SEL has an impact on student performance in reading or mathematics. There is a possibility that a third unobserved variable explains the association found in a study of this nature. Third, there was a delay between the end of training and the beginning of data collection, which was of course not the best situation. This could have had an impact, adding more error during data collection the longer the data collectors are away from their time of training. For reference, for the social emotional learning enumerators, it was approximately 3 weeks between the end of their training and the beginning of data collection. Finally, there was civil unrest in Gabao during data collection that limited our ability to collect data in that region, as we mentioned in the beginning. The sample in this region is therefore smaller than what we had planned for. We also encountered fewer students than needed for the sample in schools in Gabao in general. These tended to have smaller population of students overall, further limiting the size of the sample for this region. Also, the unique needs of learners with disabilities could be further considered in the future during the SEL measurement contextualization process. Part of the goal of this web event is to explore how assessments of SEL and pedagogy and curriculum can connect to foundational skills. The baseline assessment LTA, what we did with LTA and is presented here, offers a perspective for refining the research questions and instruments to begin uncovering where these connections may exist. This is an important first step to approach linkages to the global proficiency framework. A benchmarking policy linking workshop for reading and math is in the works with the ministry to be conducted in year 4 of the project. The Learn Together activity will conduct the social emotional learning assessment as a part of its EGRA-EGMA midline and endline. And this data will be valuable, particularly as it applies to student learning outcomes for the government of Tajikistan. We did, at the pilot stage 2, test adapted math items to see how well those worked from a universal design point of view. Alternate assessments for specific populations, such as in Braille or sign language, could be considered in upcoming work. Integration of SEL into pedagogy and curriculum is generally supportive of learners with disabilities, especially in a country like Tajikistan, where a significant proportion of learners are likely to have unidentified disabilities. The reading, math, and social emotional learning assessments use the 2 languages of instruction of the education system in Tajikistan, namely Tajik and Russian. Tajikistan has shifted Uzbek medium classrooms and schools to Tajik medium. In discussions about assessment items and instructions within assessments, the consensus was to keep the assessments in those languages, Tajik and Russian, as those are the languages that are being used and taught within the system, and the performance of students should be considered in those languages. We did, however, track outcomes of students in schools and classrooms that had been Uzbek language of instruction and have shifted to Tajik language of instruction, and in generally Pamiri speaking areas in Gabao. We did have some difficulty conducting the assessments in the schools sampled in Gabao, as noted. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Louise and Mary Faith, for those presentations. This was just such a rich exploration of your baseline study. And so I think we would like to do some question and answers with you all if we can. And I encourage those of you who haven't had the chance yet to take a look at the Slido. upvote the questions that, that really excite you, and also to add your own as we go. So far, we have 13 questions, and they sort of group into areas of policy and localization, and also in more sort of technical aspects. So taking a few of the sort of policy questions, there are questions about how you worked with USAID and the ministry to develop and implement the new instruments that you talked about um, in the presentation, how the government has supported this study, and what types of next steps you envision in this sort of localization and policy process. So can I ask either Mary Faith or Louise to jump in and speak to that while we collect additional questions?
Sure. All really important and good questions. So I think the first one you said, Kate, was about how did we work with USAID and also with the ministry?
Yes, absolutely. So how did you work with them to implement some of the new research instruments that you talked about in the presentation? And what do you see as the next steps for that sort of localization process together with the ministry?
So thinking specifically about the social emotional learning assessment instrument and the tasks on it, we, as I described, we had a workshop, which anyway, it was interesting because we had specific times of the day when we were working very intensively with our ministry colleagues, the assessment working group, meaning the Institute for Education people, and the National Testing Center, et cetera. And so we really, when we were digging into the social emotional learning assessment items, we had a really devoted group, including teachers, as we mentioned. And so in the end, after pre-testing and refinement, there was a real sense of, hey, this is really, getting all of that group out to work with students in schools during the pre-test during that workshop is a huge piece, because everybody really gets to see, like, how does this work with kids? And so we ended that with a lot of unity around, okay, this is going to be really interesting and helpful. And then, following the baseline study itself, there was a dissemination event. And so there's ongoing discussion about, what this means within the system. And I mean, I don't know if any of our colleagues have been able to join from the project, but I think the ongoing work on programming and social emotional skills within the work that the project's doing, and all of those types of things are ongoing. As far as those tools, the overarching set of tools we will be revisiting somewhat in the coming year, with the new guidance coming out on policy linking and global proficiency framework. We're going to be taking a look at the reading and math tools, just to make sure that there is a strong alignment. We certainly referenced the global proficiency framework in the previous work, but if probably people on this call realize there's new guidance out on policy linking and global proficiency framework. So at that point, it's possible that we could be discussing again the social emotional learning tools. But I guess I would just underline that this was a very strongly participatory process. And we do anticipate continuing with that participatory process as we move into midline preparation and data collection in the coming year. USAID was also very, very involved. You know, the mission in Tajikistan was very involved and had various inputs about what we were developing, and also took part in the pre-testing and the pilot, which the pilot came later after the pre-testing. So I think, you know, in the coming year, again, USAID will, you know, be closely involved in our work there with the project team, with the assessment working group, which includes ministry and all of those other groups that I mentioned. I don't know if Louise, you want to add to that.
No, I think you covered it well. Thanks, Mary Faith.
Yeah, no, thanks so much for that really detailed response. And I'm glad that it was such a participatory process. There are also a group of technical questions in the Slido around where you started with the instruments. So I think, you know, really interesting to people, what age, you know, sort of what were your baseline instruments? Did you start with ISELA, IDELA? How did you decide with which age groups you were going to work with each of those frameworks? Was there a particular curriculum framework for SEL that you started with? So just sort of what was your baseline look at instruments when you started contextualizing them?
Yeah, I think, you know, as I was describing, we were working from the curriculum in Tajikistan as far as looking at what domains do they have in social emotional learning in the curriculum. And there's often there's you know, there's kind of curriculum development going on, and so, you know, there is a curriculum in social emotional learning, but and so that's what we were looking at, you know, as far as how completely implemented that is in schools. You know, we can't tell you that completely, because I think that's part of what Learn Together activity is helping to work out, you know, in working with schools, teachers, and teacher training and such. But we did work from that, what was existing in Tajikistan, and then we drew on certainly the ISELA tool from Save the Children. A lot of us were somewhat already familiar with the ISELA tool, having been connected with it and using maybe through the years in some other contexts, and then also with just colleagues that had been involved in developing it as well. And so we worked from that, and we, you know, we're working in 2 languages. So, you know, we were working on language in Russian and language in Tajik, and talking about what certain constructs mean, to try to make sure that a term was chosen that people understood, and that connected to the way people understand a concept. And then as we mentioned in this presentation, when talking with children, to introduce a task, finding the right register of language, because, you know, to a 2nd grader or 4th grader, what kinds of language and how are we talking to that child? So all of that work was heavily and intensified in terms of trying to make sure that the way the tools were coming to children, that it would work, and that the assessor would understand it, and the child would understand it, and the task could be carried out. And let's see, was the other part of that, I'm not sure if that is there another part to the question? And I see some other questions coming up in the chat now.
Yeah, so I think there was also a question about possibility of sharing the instruments that you developed, or how others, you know, those who are interested might be able to get in touch with you all. And I'd like to make a plug for the workshop that continues this activity on Thursday. So we'll be able to dig in a little bit more. But yeah, so that was certainly a question. And there's also, if you want to take a stab, a really interesting question, both in the chat and in the Slido, about why we want to make this connection in the first place. So why do we need to know that social emotional learning impacts learning and achievement? Isn't SEL beneficial by itself the same way that literacy and numeracy are? And so what is the reason to ask this question in the first place?
Yeah, that's the question from Saeed Yassin, right?
Yes, it is.
Okay, yeah, it's of course an important question as well. I think we mentioned at the top of this presentation that just from a theoretical framework point of view, just drawing on the existing literature, that these types of skills are important or do have an influence and are connected to greater learning outcomes in, quote, academic areas like reading and math. So that's been established. As we mentioned, most of that research, as often is the case, comes from high-income countries. And so, as we mentioned, this was an opportunity to try to look at that in a different context. And often, I think a lot of our research is trying to do that within a project framework. But we do sometimes say, sometimes there are things we already know and we don't necessarily need to prove it again. We just need to dive in and do the work and see how the work itself needs to be contextualized in a different set of circumstances. But I do think there is an interest in the broader, kind of community to look at evidence that, what does this look like in different contexts. So that was part of it. But I totally think the point that is brought into that question, which is, these skills are important in and of themselves. Whether they bring an academic gain or not, they are important in and of themselves, and we know that as well. So that I think that's a good reminder that I think, are we asking the right questions here? I think as researchers, we always want to step back and say that, and so I appreciate the question. So I think that all of those points are helpful, that SEL is beneficial in and of itself. But with such a strong push for reading and math foundational skills over the past 10 to 15 years, driven a lot by USAID's leadership in that area, I think the advent or the greater focus now on bringing the social emotional learning into that is important, because if we're bringing in, a program that's not also focused on those human aspects of child development and what those mean for overall well-being, then maybe we're going to miss the boat a little bit on the foundational learning that we are trying so hard to make happen. So, and I think, it plays really an important role in learner environment, the classroom environment. And we know that a positive classroom learning environment is of critical importance for children's development, their learning and their progress in these grades. And I would just also mention that we were working in grade 2 and 4 because that has been, those two grades have been the focus over the past years with the early grade reading assessments that have been done through the years in Tajikistan. So it was a continuation of working on those two grades. That's how those grades were selected. So, and I think I do see that there's another question here from Michel Avassa about language. So that could be, I don't know, Kate, if we want to talk about that one.
Yes, absolutely. And I think also looking for, advice on contextualizing specifically to Africa, but there are several other questions in the Slido that also touch on these issues. So yeah, beyond attending the workshop on Thursday, very curious about your advice to participants with those questions.
Yeah, do you want me to
Yes, please do.
talk about that one?
Yeah.
So I guess everybody can see the question. So the students start learning in a language of instruction, for example, in French or in English, thinking about Francophone and Anglophone contexts and on the continent of Africa and different countries. So even though they're talking and existing and living in languages at home that are not those languages. So it's interesting because just thinking about our Tajikistan data, we mentioned that there's a population of students, certainly in Tajikistan, that are Uzbek speakers at home in their families, but they're going to a school that's Tajik speaking. And we did, that wasn't the subject of our webinar, but we did look at those students. And, it's what you would imagine, there's a difference in what the students that are in the schools that shifted from Uzbek to Tajik, meaning they teach in Tajik now. But many of them, most of them are Uzbek speakers at home. So, as far as looking at tools, I think Louise mentioned that the choice was made on this. There was a lot of discussion around this, but it's important to the system to be looking at how students respond and perform in the two languages that they're learning in, whether they're in a Russian classroom or a Tajik classroom, that the instruments themselves come to them in those languages to see how well they do in those languages. So, I think it's such a huge and multi-layered question and set of responses about languages and how we assess students, as well as languages and how we teach students. Because there's so many different pieces to unpack when we're developing assessment, and how is it accessible to the student, and then how is it useful to the system to understand how the students are doing. So there's not like a quick and easy answer, but we find that we often end up with kind of an ecology of responses. We're doing in how the instruments themselves need to come across or come out in the end, and then how we need to be able to explain what we can learn from them. So I think we could continue talking about this on the Thursday webinar, and I hope some of the folks that posted some of these questions will come to that webinar, because we're going to have the Padlet where you can put your answers to different questions, and then we can also, keep a record of what the community of practice that can come Thursday, what they respond and how the discussion flows. And I think that's how this conversation can move forward and have an impact on the research and the evaluation that all of us are doing. I don't know, Kate, what do you think?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think on Thursday we will have some time to dig more deeply into some of these questions. And we are just about at the end of our time, but I can see also for us to think about for the next session on Thursday, some questions in the chat and in the Slido about the framework that you used for contextualization, how you really approach that question, I think in a deep and technical way, and whether and how you would be able to share any of the assessment tools that you used. I think there's a real hunger in this participant group for that sort of technical know-how and best practices, which is really what we will jump into on Thursday. I want to give really huge and sincere thanks to our two presenters, to Mary Faith and Louise, for joining us today and sharing this experience in Tajikistan. I know that we had to delay this webinar to this date. And so I'm thrilled that so many people have been able to reschedule and to join us for this discussion. I hope you stick with us on Thursday and continue to join. If you have questions about how to join, please drop us a note at USAID-ECCN@edc.org and we will let you know. Please also use the QR codes on this slide to follow us on LinkedIn, to join ECCN. And I can see a question in the chat about the recording. These will be available on the LTLGP YouTube channel a few days after the event. So we will certainly keep you posted about that as well. Mary Faith, Louise, any final words of closing from you all?
Thank you to everybody who joined, and very much encourage you to come back Thursday and let's even delve even deeper into this. Thank you.
Yes, just I echo the same. Thank you all for being here and some really interesting questions. I hope we get the chance to talk about more on Thursday. So thank you.
Everyone have a wonderful rest of your day or evening, and please do fill out the post-event survey that you will find when you exit Zoom.